My name is Helen and I live in Dallas, Texas. I'm 58 now, but some days I feel 100. People always say motherhood is the most beautiful thing you'll ever experience. They don't tell you what it feels like when the person you loved more than life itself decides you don't exist anymore. That's what happened to me the day my daughter walked out of my life and never looked back. It's funny, I still remember the sound of her voice that morning. Cold. Final. She didn't even meet my eyes. She just said her father had already told her enough about me. She didn't need to hear my side. Then she left, and a part of me went with her. I stood there in the doorway, after she drove away, watching the taillights disappear down the street. My hand was still on the doorknob, like if I let go, the whole house would come apart. I called her later that night. No answer. The next day, I tried again. My calls went straight to voicemail. Eventually, the line just rang and rang until it didn't anymore. She blocked my number, my email, everything. I even showed up at her campus one weekend just hoping to catch a glimpse of her, just to see her face. But she sent security to ask me to leave. That was the moment I realized. She didn't just leave me. She erased me. I can't tell you how many nights I sat in the kitchen, staring at my phone, hoping she would change her mind. Hoping she'd call. I kept the house spotless back then, thinking maybe if she came home someday, she'd see how much I cared. But the door never opened. It's hard to explain what it feels like to be a mother without a child. You still think about them every day. You still remember the way their hair smelled when they were little, the way they'd run to you when they got hurt. But now there's this empty space where their laugh used to be. You walk past their bedroom, and it feels like a museum of someone else's life. People ask me why I didn't move on, why I didn't find something else to fill the void. But how do you move on from your own flesh and blood? How do you stop waiting for the person you raised to remember that you're human too? I've learned to smile through it most days. People don't want to hear about that kind of pain, but it stays with you. It sits in your chest and waits for quiet moments to remind you. She was my little girl, my only girl, and she left me behind like I was nothing. 8 years ago, my whole life came apart in a way I couldn't have imagined. I thought Mark and I were solid. We'd been married for over 20 years, and I thought that meant something. I'd spent my life taking care of him, raising Emily, keeping the house warm and clean, so they never wanted for anything. But that wasn't enough. I found out about her on a Tuesday. Mark didn't even try to deny it when I asked. He just said he wasn't happy anymore, and he'd met someone who made him feel alive again. She was 27. I was 50 at the time. That stung in a way I still can't put into words. What hurt worse was how quickly Emily turned on me. She didn't even give me a chance to explain. Mark had his story ready. When I tried to tell her my side, she cut me off. She said she'd already heard enough, that she knew the truth and didn't want to hear any more lies. That's what Mark called it. Lies. She moved out a week after he did and went straight to stay with him. The day she packed her things, I stood in her doorway, just watching her fold shirts into a duffel bag. She didn't look at me once. Not even when she brushed past me in the hall. I followed her out to the car and said, "Please don't leave like this." But she shut the door and drove off without saying a word. I called her every day that first month, left voicemails, sent emails, even wrote a few letters and mailed them to her campus. When I couldn't stand it anymore, I drove out there just to see her. I sat in the parking lot of her dorm for hours, hoping she'd walk by. When she finally did, she saw me and froze. Then she pulled out her phone, and minutes later, a security guard came and asked me to leave. I cried the whole drive home. I must have looked like a fool to everyone passing me on the freeway. I kept thinking there must have been something else I could have said. something that would have made her understand. The divorce went through and Mark got the house. I moved into a small rental apartment on the other side of town. I got a job at the grocery store stocking shelves at night. The pay barely covered rent and utilities. I stopped buying anything extra. Even coffee felt like a luxury. Around the same time, my mother's health started to decline. She was already slipping when the divorce happened. By the next year, she couldn't be left alone. So I started caring for her full time during the day and working nights. Those were some of the longest, loneliest months of my life. I didn't tell Emily. I told myself she didn't want to hear from me anyway. But every night after my shift, I'd sit at the kitchen table and look at my phone. I never deleted her number. I thought maybe one day she'd call. Maybe one day she'd need me again. My mother passed a year ago this spring. It was a quiet morning when it happened. I was sitting next to her bed, holding her hand. She just stopped breathing. I kissed her forehead and called the hospice nurse. The funeral was small. Just a few cousins I hadn't seen in years. When it was over, everyone left, and I stayed behind. I stood there at her grave for what felt like hours looking at the name carved in stone. It was my mother's name, but all I could think about was my own. How one day that would be me, and there would be no one left to stand there and remember. That was the first time I really felt erased. Like I'd lived my whole life giving, and somehow I'd ended up invisible. I walked back to my car, sat down, and just let the quiet settle in. The cemetery was empty by then. It felt like it always was. Like it had always been just me. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, 2 months after my mother's funeral. I was sitting in the living room, half watching a rerun on television, when my phone started buzzing on the coffee table. I almost didn't pick up because I didn't recognize the number, but something in me reached for it anyway. The voice on the other end was quiet, hesitant. At first, I didn't even recognize her. Then she said my name. Mom. Just one word, and my heart nearly stopped beating. It was Emily. My daughter calling me after 8 long years of nothing. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, scared she'd hang up before I could say anything. She asked how I'd been. Said she'd heard about her grandmother passing and wanted to check on me. I could barely form words. My throat felt too tight to speak. But somehow I told her I was doing fine, that I appreciated her calling. There was a pause, then she said she wanted to see me. To talk in person. She suggested dinner at my place the following Saturday. I agreed so quickly it almost sounded desperate. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she didn't care. Either way, before I knew it, the call was over, and I just sat there staring at my phone like it had turned into something sacred. That whole week felt like a dream. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat without feeling sick. But I cleaned every corner of that little house like it was about to be shown to royalty. I dusted shelves I hadn't touched in years, scrubbed the baseboards on my knees, even polished the old china cabinet, the one she used to hide behind when she played hide and seek as a little girl. On Friday, I went to the store and bought everything I needed for her favorite dish. Shrimp Alfredo. She used to ask for it on her birthday every year. I picked out a bouquet of fresh flowers too. Not for her exactly, but for the table. The house needed to look alive again. Saturday morning, I woke up before sunrise. My hands were shaking so bad I spilled coffee all over the counter. I kept checking the clock, counting down the hours. Every little sound made me jump. When it was finally time, I lit a few candles and set the table with my best plates. The smell of garlic and cream filled the kitchen. I stood there in my apron, staring at the clock, feeling my chest tighten with every passing minute. I hadn't felt this nervous since my wedding day. I kept running through what I'd say to her. Would I tell her how much she'd hurt me, Or would I just hold her and tell her I'd missed her every single day? My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the serving spoon. When the doorbell finally rang, I froze. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter, unable to move for a second. I felt like a little girl waiting to be chosen, like my whole life had been leading up to this one moment. And I didn't know if I was ready. Emily walked in right on time, and for a moment, everything about her felt familiar. She looked older, of course, but there was still a softness in her face that reminded me of the little girl who used to sit at my kitchen table with crayons. I hugged her without thinking, and though she stiffened at first, she let me hold her. It almost felt like nothing had changed. We sat down to eat, and the conversation was awkward but polite. I asked about her job, and she gave short, careful answers. She complimented the meal, even smiled a little when I mentioned I'd made it just the way she liked. For a while, I let myself believe this was a real reunion, that maybe she had finally come home to me. But as the plates cleared and the silence stretched, I finally asked her why now. Why after all these years? She hesitated, looking down at her hands, then said she was engaged. That the wedding was going to be expensive and money was tight. She'd remembered Grandma promising her something years ago. The inheritance. She thought it might still be hers. I sat very still as she talked. She kept her eyes low, her words careful, but I could hear the edge of need in her voice. I forced myself to nod, to keep my face calm. But my heart sank with every word. She didn't come back for me. Not for this house. Not for the memories or the years I'd spent waiting. She came back because she thought there was something left for her to take. When she finally looked up, there was hope in her eyes, the same way a stranger might look at a banker waiting to hear if a loan was approved. I swallowed hard and told her I'd think about it. I even smiled, though it felt like my chest was splitting open. I excused myself to the kitchen to clear the dishes, my hands shaking as I ran water in the sink. The scent of garlic and cream still hung in the air, but it was sour now. My daughter was sitting in the next room, waiting for my answer, and all I could think was how small I suddenly felt. She hadn't come home. She'd come to make a transaction. And somehow, that hurt worse than all the silence that came before. I sat back down at the table and looked at her for a long moment before I spoke. She fidgeted under my stare, her fingers tapping against her water glass like she couldn't stand the quiet. When I finally opened my mouth, my voice was calm, low, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. I told her I knew why she'd really come back, that this wasn't about family or forgiveness. This was about money. I could see the denial flash in her eyes, but she didn't say anything, so I kept going. I asked her if she knew what it felt like to sit alone in a hospital room watching her own mother fade away. To plan a funeral by herself because no one else cared enough to show up. Her face felt confusion, giving way to something that almost looked like guilt. Then I took my phone out of my pocket and slid it across to her. I told her to unblock my number. Her hand trembled as she did it, and when she looked back at me, I started forwarding every message I'd ever sent. One by one, each one lighting up her screen. Updates about her grandmother's condition. Invitations to visit before it was too late. A desperate plea the day before the funeral asking her to come say goodbye. I didn't raise my voice or rush her. I just sat there and let the truth sink in. She scrolled through them slower and slower, her face growing paler with each one. By the time she looked up at me, her eyes were wide, and for the first time all night, she had nothing to say. I told her she'd missed everything that mattered, that she'd erased herself from the only moments she couldn't ever get back. My tone never wavered, but inside my chest, the ache was sharp and deep. She opened her mouth like she might try to explain, but I cut her off with nothing more than a quiet shake of my head. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix. And judging by the look on her face, She finally understood that too. 3 days later, my phone rang again, late in the evening when the house was quiet. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something told me to answer. The second I heard his voice on the line, my stomach tightened. It was Mark. He started by saying he knew what had happened with Emily. His tone was measured, almost careful, like he expected me to hang up at any second. He said he'd heard everything from her and that he wanted to apologize. I stayed silent for a few moments, letting him fill the empty space with words I'd never expected to hear. He admitted he was wrong back then, that he'd made her believe things about me that weren't true because he was angry and selfish. He even said he'd convinced himself I deserved it. When he finished, I finally spoke. My voice was steady, even softer than I expected, but it carried more weight than all his words. I told him I didn't need his apology. I told him I'd carried his choices on my back long enough and I wasn't willing to do it anymore. He tried to tell me he never realized how much damage he'd caused, that he thought she would figure things out on her own eventually, that he never meant for her to cut me out completely. I didn't flinch at any of it. I just told him that didn't change anything. There was a long pause on his end of the line. I could hear his breathing slow and heavy, like he was searching for something else to say. But I didn't let him find it. I told him I had nothing left to give to his guilt. Not anymore. When I hung up, the silence felt heavier than before, but in a different way, like a door finally closing. For the first time in years, I realized just how little power he had over me now, and just how strong I had become without him. Mark's voice softened as he tried again, saying Emily was still my daughter no matter what. He told me she was young back then, that she didn't know any better, and I should try to forgive her. He said blood was blood, and family didn't just stop being family. I let him finish before I answered, keeping my tone steady, even though my hands gripped the edge of the table. I told him I understood she would always be my daughter by blood, but that didn't mean I could trust her. I reminded him trust is something you build with actions, not something you inherit. He didn't say anything at first, just let out a long sigh, like he thought I was being too harsh. I told him I'd spent 8 years waiting for her to come back, and when she finally did, it wasn't because she missed me. It was because she thought I owed her something. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep sacrificing myself just to say I'd done the right thing. I told Mark I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't willing to give away what little I had left of myself. The silence on his end of the line said he finally understood. I hung up with a strange calm settling over me. It hurt to say it out loud, but it also felt like a release. For the first time, I was choosing myself. And it was long overdue. The letter came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, tucked among a stack of bills and junk mail. I didn't recognize the handwriting at first, but my chest tightened as soon as I saw my name written so carefully across the envelope. It had no return address, but I didn't need one to know who it was from. I sat at the kitchen table for a while before I opened it, just staring at the crease of the flap and tracing the letters of my name with my finger. When I finally slid it open, a small photograph slipped out and landed on the table. It was Emily, no more than 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders, with her pigtails flying and the biggest grin on her face. The note was short, written in her familiar slant words, slightly shaky, like her hand couldn't quite keep up with her thoughts. She wrote that she didn't know how to fix what she'd broken, that maybe she never could, but she wanted me to know I'd been the best mom she could have asked for, and that she was sorry for not realizing it sooner. I read the words 3 times before folding the paper back into the envelope. My fingers lingered on the photo as I picked it up, staring at the little girl who had once thought the world of me. I smiled a little, despite the ache still sitting in my chest. I walked into the living room and stood in front of the mantel where my mother's framed picture already sat. I placed Emily's photo next to it, straightening it so it stood tall and steady. Then I stepped back, letting the sight of it settle in. The house was quiet as I stood there, the kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, but now felt almost peaceful. I thought about picking up the phone and calling her, just to say I got it, but my hand stayed at my side. Not out of anger, not even out of hurt, but because I finally understood that some things take more than words to heal. And for now, this small gesture was enough. Some nights, I still catch myself listening for her voice, the way it used to fill this house like sunlight. But then I remind myself that waiting for someone to come back doesn't fix what they broke. It only keeps you trapped in the same hurt. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean you let someone back into your life. It can simply mean you stop letting what they did define you. That you choose to let go of the anger, but also the expectation that things will ever be the way they were. For a long time, I thought being her mother meant I had to keep giving no matter how much it cost me. But now I see it differently. Love is a choice, and trust is a choice too. If she ever chooses to truly see me, I'll still be here. But I won't keep chasing someone who only remembers me when it's convenient. I feel lighter now, as though a weight I didn't even know I was carrying has finally fallen away. This quiet doesn't scare me anymore. It feels like peace. For the first time in years, I don't need anyone else to tell me who I am. And I don't need anyone else to tell me I'm enough.